Now, I got quite excited when Dominic Cummings decided to go and turn on Boris Johnson because Dominic Cummings was a man who was always, shall we say, looking over the shoulder, pardon me, looking over the shoulder of the Prime Minister. He saw everything Boris did or didn't do and the chaos that, well, Boris has created. And as much as you want to sometimes believe Dominic Cummings about these allegations, you've got to remember that those allegations did come after he had been sacked and fired, obviously from his position in a Downing Street reshuffle. Of course, there was much hailing about, Boris is now being freed from, Dominic Cummings' influence. Everything's going to change in Downing Street. But of course, it didn't. The chaos is still there. And I've been waiting for other people to come forward, working in those different departments, to come forward and at least verify a lot of what Dominic Cummings actually had to say at that time. So now we've had someone come out from the Foreign Office, and they've gone very interesting into a lot of detail about what happened, obviously, during the Afghanistan withdrawal. And to be of absolutely no surprise at all, they show the absolute utter failings that just went on in that department under Boris Johnson. Because as Dominic Cummings even said at that time, and as we'll go into this article here, there is nothing but complete chaos, which is not how you should be running something important like that. It's very, very terrifying. So, as always, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button before we do continue. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do support the channel that way. So, let's jump into this article then. This comes from The Guardian with the title, "Whether in Britain or Afghanistan, Johnson's government fails and fails again." To someone in a remote place cut off by hostile weather, a friendly face in a uniform might be a welcome sight, although not as welcome as the lights coming back on. Around 300 armed forces personnel have been on manoeuvres in rural parts of the northeast England and Scotland, checking on vulnerable people in the aftermath of the storm Arwen, and according to the Ministry of Defence, providing reassurance. In a more tyrannical regime, that phrase, coupled with the imagery of soldiers going door to door, would have a very sinister ring. In Britain, it is uncontroversial, which should not necessarily a sign of healthy politics. A deployment of the military to try and bail out civil authorities should not be taboo, nor should it be routine. In October, when the petrol pumps ran dry, the army was brought in ostensibly to help drive tankers, but also to show the panicking motorists that the government had things under control, providing reassurance. There are some peacetime jobs that only trained military personnel can do. Bomb disposal, for example. There are episodes of turmoil when politicians need to throw a flash of khaki in to prove that they're still in charge. The military drivers were obviously put on standby during the 200 fuel protests, during the 2000 fuel protests. And of course, troops obviously stepped in to provide security for the 2012 Olympics when the private contractor fell short. Military involvement has long been a measure of security in floods and other national disasters as well. The pandemic has also been seen as another huge increase in the use of Whitehall calls to marker the military aid to the civilian authorities. Soldiers have erected field hospitals, moved people to protective equipment around, provided logistic support for testing and vaccination programs, and army medics have also been critical to the front line as well. The scale of the COVID challenge has required something like a wartime mobilization, and Britain is not the only country to have leaned on its armed forces. But there is a difference between the occasionally military auxiliary action and playing backstop to a state that just cannot cope with the stress. The need for such a service speaks to some very deeper malaise in the workings of the government, which brings us to the evacuation of Kabul. Here, the crisis was already military by nature, and the pressure to deliver was entirely on the civilian authorities that failed. The London side of the operation was dysfunctional and chaotic, and according to a testimony by the civil service whistleblower to Parliament inquiry, the scene in the Foreign Office was depicted by Rachel Marshall, a former desk officer at the department, as one of institutional and individual failure at every level. Dominic Raab, the then Foreign Secretary, now the Justice Secretary, is portrayed as an indecisive control freak, fussing over the formatting of documents instead of engaging with their contents, and delaying action on the cases despite Afghans seeking refuge from vengeful Taliban forces. Thousands of emails representing matters of life and death just went unread in the deserted offices as staff just clocked off at the end of their Friday shifts. The Taliban didn't get the memo about not needing to work weekends. To that extent, Downing Street took interest in very particular cases. The lucky evacuees even appearing to have been animals in the care of a rescue charity run by Paul Penfarthing. The marshal testified that the considerable capacity had to be allocated for Farthing's cargo on instructions from the Prime Minister. Number 10 also denies that Boris Johnson made the call, and Farthing obviously rejects claims that he and his pet project diverted military resources. But the safe passage was a very precious, finite resource, and arranging capacity for dogs was very much a distraction from rescuing people. Raab very much disputes Marshall's account. He concedes that there are lessons to be learned in, quote, hindsight, but does not specify what they might be beyond his previously expressed regret of having to try and manage this crisis from a bench in Crete. The subsequent removal from the Foreign Office was punishment for having bungled the brief. More precisely, it was a rebuke for the ineptitude on such a scale as to the inactive security of the Prime Minister's role in the debacle. Johnson, too, had been on holiday. Raab's offence was not incompetence, but failure to keep the tide of the bad headlines away from the threshold of number 10. He is still in the cabinet and still Deputy Prime Minister. Now, of course, all the government failings are the fault of ministers. There is also the Conservative reading of the Marshal's testimony. The evacuation programme was inhibited by the volume of people working from home and by a culture that valorised a work-life balance. Not much of that for some staff entitled to their leisure-trumpeted public service. The riposte would be that being short-staffed is more than a function of inadequate budgeting and a deficit of work ethic. The same arguments swirl all around the government's handling of the pandemic. There is a view from the right that finds fault in the rusty, overprivileged, antique civil service machine, unfit for a very 21st century challenge. And there is also the counterclaim from the left that austerity has stripped the state of assets needed to get the job done properly. That's where I'd stand on that. Both sides, of course, can be right. The aforementioned, obviously, state bureaucracy might lack the agility to actually deal with the complex emergency, while underfunded services are obviously easily overwhelmed. In both instances, inactivity and cowardly leadership makes the difference, turning complications into a crisis. And of course, this takes a very special arrogance and stupidity to the top to obstruct the flow of the urgent lower down in the hierarchy. There are obviously flaws in the British state that predate the current government and managerial problems that are common in all large organisations, both private and public. But there is a particular moral flimsiness about the Johnson regime that takes administrative dysfunction to a new level. In this pattern of unprecedented and indecisionness, leading to reckless choices with terrible consequences, followed by a flight from responsibility, it is the effect of the hypersensitive to the public demand that something be done, applied in the absence of the ethical core to dictate what the action should be. This was all eloquently expressed in the dereliction of duty over Afghanistan. By the time the crisis caught up with Raab and Johnson, the moment to grip it had already passed. There was no option for calling in the armed forces. They were already there in Kabul doing their job, which is not the scene back in Whitehall or even Downing Street. This is what happens when government is led by people who seek the thrill of power without wanting the burden of office. This is the terrible price for complacency that has been paid by the Afghans who called for Britain for sanctuary and got no answer. And I think more of these stories are going to come forward. I do think this isn't the last. Obviously, like I say, this inquiry is still ongoing. And I think we'll have to see how much Raab will survive in this. I think he will. I think he will still be, again, Deputy Prime Minister. Again, it's not like he has any power as Deputy Prime Minister. it's just a fancy title, really, at the end of the day, that Boris gave him, because I think he was very upset about being flung out of the Home Office. And I think Boris wanted to, shall we say, keep him sweet, so he gave him that little bauble. Again, it's a meaningless title because we've never had an official office of the Deputy Prime Minister. So, again, this just goes to show you the more dysfunctional how this government really is, and is treating office as, woo, I'm in power, but not understanding or even wanting to accept the responsibilities of power, which in itself is incredibly dangerous. And I expect more stories like this to come forward in the following years and weeks that we see this government in power. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.